there is a tempo to operations, and Israel has been engaged in some very intense operations, and you can't really sustain that momentum long term. And so this may be a natural time when it's regrouping, and so it allows for this kind of pause anyway. So I think that's one. But the second thing I think is I can't imagine this sort of converting itself into a long-term ceasefire because Israel wants to obtain hostages. It wants to rescue hostages in any kind of deal with Hamas. And so giving away this ceasefire for free in some sense doesn't really serve Israel's interests.
Why haven't we seen more raids then, Kelly? We talked about one involving 4 hostages who were rescued at the expense, according to Hamas, of more than 250 Palestinians during that raid. Are we going to see more activity like that, or do they simply not know where the hostages are?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been an intense debate about this exact issue, which is one, it is an intelligence challenge, of course, of knowing where they're located and being able to safely do this, meaning that you don't kill the hostages in the process. So that is certainly a challenge. And then the second part is there's been suggestions, it's very contentious inside Israel, of whether the government is really prioritizing the rescue of hostages, or if it's more focused on really combating Hamas itself. And that, of course, has been a real source of contention within Israeli society.
Well, and now it seems there is an open question, Kelly, about not just going to bat against Hamas, but Hezbollah as well. We were just talking about Amos Hochstein from the administration in the region now, trying to make sure that things don't escalate on the northern border with Lebanon. How concerned would you be in this moment about another front opening up?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very concerning. What we're seeing is this slow-moving escalation since October 7th. And in a way, because it's so slow-moving, you can sort of almost fool yourself into thinking it won't happen. But what we're seeing is that a series of sort of escalating attacks in scale and in terms of intensity over especially the last couple weeks. And so I don't think either side necessarily wants to get into a full-scale war, but we're in a really, I think, dangerous period where neither side may consciously start a war, but could inadvertently do so. And certainly the rhetoric on both sides is very intense. And I think this mission by Hochstein is there in particular to try to tell the Israelis to not, consider launching some kind of limited ground invasion into Lebanon. This certainly, if that were to happen, would create a lot of problems for the United States, in particular in terms of being able to support the Israelis, even in terms of weapons and equipment.
Yeah. Well, that's my question here. To what extent would that further complicate U.S. relations with Iran? Would that put the U.S. in a more precarious position than it is with Hamas?
Yeah, I think that is absolutely right. I mean, the relationship between Hamas and Iran is not as close as the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah. And so I think the possibility of Iran intervening far more directly if there was an intervention between Israel into Lebanon is far more likely. Iran has certainly signaled that's far more likely to take action if there was a war between Israel and Hezbollah. And so I think, we're trying to avoid a regional conflict. And so that danger becomes far more heightened if we actually see this war be taken to Lebanon. And that's something we've been trying so actively to avoid. And the United States, really, the kinds of trade-offs would become so acute for the United States. We're trying to support a war in Ukraine. We have, significant concerns in the Indo-Pacific. And if this becomes a regional conflict, trying to do all of this is frankly not possible to support all of these allies and partners. And it would really create really acute trade-offs very quickly.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Kelly. There are so many hot conflicts that the U.S. is paying acute attention to right now, including, as you just mentioned, Ukraine. And I would like to ask you about Vladimir Putin's trip to North Korea this week. The first time he has gone there since the year 2000. Of course, there's been a lot of reporting of suspicions that Kim Jong-un's regime has been sending missiles to Russia to allow it to continue its war in Ukraine. How do you view this visit and the relationship between these two leaders?
Yes. Well, I mean, this is a marriage of convenience. Putin has turned to Kim Jong-un to be able to get, old stockpiles that the North Koreans have of lots of artillery, including, it seems, some short-range ballistic missiles. And these are systems that are compatible with old Soviet equipment. What this has allowed for the Russians is essentially to use these sort of millions of artillery rounds that have been provided to sustain them while they're building up their own industrial production. And in exchange, this has been a good deal for Kim. He's gotten lots of economic aid, it seems, some technology around space satellites, and including apparently a luxury limousine has been sent to Kim as well. And it's certainly, it's increased his image on the international stage.
Fascinating. Considering what North Korea is providing, are they just filling the gap that China has left? Didn't Vladimir Putin try to get all of this initially from Beijing?
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think it's worth noting that the quality of this is in question from what we know on the battlefield, so that certainly provides some information for the North Koreans. And from what we know, the Chinese are not particularly happy about this relationship. There was some reporting suggesting that the Chinese explicitly asked Putin not to go directly from their May visit when Putin went to Beijing, to go directly to North Korea, because they don't want it looking like the new axis of evil in the West. They would like to create some distance. And I don't think it's an accident that Putin is visiting North Korea and then he's visiting Vietnam, again, to sort of maybe create a little bit of distance so that it doesn't look as though there's some anti-Western bloc forming. Whether that will be successful is another matter. But this creates some headaches for Beijing.
Of course, Kelly, all of this is coming in the aftermath of the G7 in Italy last week, in which we saw not only the countries agreeing to use frozen Russian assets to provide a $50 billion loan to Ukraine, but the signing of this 10-year security agreement between the U.S. and Ukraine. How significant is that really if it's not an enforceable treaty?
Yeah, you said exactly the right thing, which is it's not an enforceable treaty. So it's largely symbolic, in my opinion. It's symbolic politics, and that's about it. If this was something that was to go to Congress and be a treaty, that would be a different matter. But any president could come in and overturn it. So symbolic politics.